Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and is Daggerheart the new D&D killer? A little too much? Okay. I know a lot of channels are talking about it this way, and let me get something straight. Well, D&D and Daggerheart are different games, despite many of their similarities. I do think there's a conversation to be had when it comes to Daggerheart's future play, since it's not fully released yet, when it comes to general tabletop gaming. I'll get to that a bit later, but first let's talk about Daggerheart, my experience with it, and my overall impression. So, if you're completely unaware of what Daggerheart is, you can see here behind me, recently, Critical Role's game development company, Darrington Press, has released a open beta version of their up-and-coming kind of major TTRPG, Daggerheart. So, as you can see up here, they're giving a general introduction to what Daggerheart is, but let me give you all a rundown. Daggerheart is essentially a crunchier rules-like game system that has a heavier setting in high fantasy and definitely pulls from many of Critical Role's full campaigns. You're going to see a lot of very familiar faces as we kind of go over the game in general. Now, while this is a playtest, they did leave us with something pretty meaty with all kinds of different touchstones, ways to look at tabletop, a lot of stuff for more beginner players for sure. And they do even touch a little bit onto what their setting is, but there's no definitive setting that is coming with the open beta. Now, the general rule system revolves around the duality dice, which are 2d12s, that one representing fear and the other representing hope. And it is a system that utilizes a somewhat tug-of-war system with the GM and the players when it comes to the outcome of results. You roll both duality dice and you add the values together. The difference comes from if the higher die is hope or if the higher die is fear. Hope is something that the players generally want to do. It gives them a hope resource that they can use for other class features and some general play functions. And fear allows the GM to gain fear from the players to use against them in some form or fashion. And even if you roll with fear, it doesn't mean you necessarily fail. As you can read here behind me, I know the text is probably small if you're doing this on your phone, but more or less what it says is that there are essentially 5 states of success and failure. So there is a critical success when both the dice are the same value, you succeed whatever you're trying to do, and you get a little bit extra. The player also takes a hope and clears a stress, something I'll mention in a little bit. Now, on a success, meaning the 2 die values equal higher than the target number, and it's a hope, the players get a hope and they do what they want to do. Though if it's a fear and a success, the players succeed, but there is some consequence. Now, if they fail with hope, they just fail and they get whatever the fail state is. But if they fail with fear, the failure is much worse. Not necessarily, game breaking worse, but it is worse. They fail with complications. And similarly, when you fail with hope, the player still gets hope. And if you fail with fear, the GM still gets fear. So there's a lot of this hope and fear resource. Well, as I said before, the hope resource can be used by players to activate a variety of features. You can see here on these cards behind me, which is something I'll get to in a little bit. The human, for instance, when they're using one of their experiences on a check and they get a fail, they can spend one of their accrued hope to re-roll and get a new result. Granted, they need to take the new result. The GM, on the other hand, can use fear to do a variety of things. They can do general fear options, like do something big, or they can do something more specific to a creature that has what's known as a fear move, making a much more dangerous move that forces the GM to make to expend a resource. The GM can also take advantage on rolls against the players or even add damage as they see fit. So obviously, while the players can use hope to do some really good things, the GM also has the ability to counteract that with fear. So now that we talked a little bit about how the game's dice system works and how fear and hope work, let's talk about what the characters are. What can you expect as a player to use in the game? Well, this game uses a very interesting playset building system. And what I mean by that is you're going to have your character sheet, but you're going to have additional sheets and cards that help you play the game. Now, if you play digitally, you're going to be in a little bit of a rough spot, as right now we only have a digital compendium through Demiplay Nexus, which is a site, if you're unaware, that has all kinds of digital aid tools for a variety of tabletop games. In the future, I'm very sure we're going to get a Roll20 and maybe even a Foundry or other systems that allow you to play digitally better. But the game is designed to have a playset kind of idea where you have your character sheet and you're going to put cards on it that represent your character to visually make your character sheet pop, and not to have a bunch of character sheets that you need to read fine text through. For instance, when you are starting, you're going to pick an ancestry. So you're going to select one of these ancestry cards. Each ancestry has a little bit of lore and, of course, has some function that they do, something that makes them good in comparison to others. One of my favorites is a dwarf. They have increased fortitude, which whenever they would take physical damage, which there is 2 types of damage in this game, physical and magical. Whenever a dwarf would take physical damage, they may spend 3 hope, very expensive, but they can reduce the damage in half, which is really good considering how damage is done in the system, but that's something we'll get to in a little bit. After you set your ancestry, you're going to select the community you were born into. This represents where your character is from, and one of the great things about this system is it doesn't mandate that characters of particular ancestries must grow up in certain settings. And while many tabletops don't necessarily enforce that an ancestry grows up in a particular setting, they do heavily imply that typically that's where they come from. In this system, you have a community, and they also provide to you a variety of benefits. Loreborn, for instance, allows you to take advantage on any roll when it comes to dealing with history, culture, or politics of a prominent person or place, which can be really good in a lot of, non-combat situations. And speaking on advantage, since it's come up here in one of the cards, advantage in this game is not like D&D 5e's advantage, though for the GM it kind of is. What I mean by that is, as a player, when you get advantage on a roll, you roll a d6 and you add that to the value of your dice. Not changing the whichever die rolled higher, but just adding to the overall value. So when you roll your 2d12 and you get, say, a 3 on one and a 4 on another, you can roll a d6 and potentially increase that 7 to a potential success of like minimum 9 is what I've seen for a lot of enemies, which means you just need to roll a 2 on that advantage die. Once you pick your ancestry and where you're from, you're going to pick your class. And honestly, this is where most people start when it comes to what kind of character they're playing. But as the game is set up, this is kind of how it works. The classes, they have a fair number of classes. Let's see, how many do they have here? Yeah, so they have 9 classes that you can find here, but each class is separated into subclasses. So you can see here on the Bard part of the compendium, we have here a variety of things. First, let's talk about the subclasses I mentioned before. So the Bard has 2 subclasses that can affect generally how you play. The Wordsmith, for instance, allows you to, when you're trying to convince a person or impress them, if at least you have 3 rhyming words in whatever you're saying, which is kind of goofy, you can add a d6 to the action roll against them to add to your persuasion, essentially. While the Troubadour gains access to unique instruments that can be used in combat typically, or outside of combat, for a variety of things. Like, for instance, their unique weapon or instrument allows them to perform an epic song during battle, making an enemy vulnerable, which means all attacks against them take advantage. Going back up here to the top, we also have a few things to point out. We have domains, and the general like health system of a character. But let's talk about domains first. So domains relate specifically to the kinds of action cards or move cards specifically that your character gets access to. Grace, which is one of the ones that Bard gets access to, gives you all kinds of different kinds of illusions or persuasion like abilities. You can see the cards here behind me, and each of these cards have a set of values that should be somewhat important to you as a player. First is the level. You can see in the top left corner what level your character gets access to this particular card. Then there's the ability, and then there is the stamina cost. Now, your character actually gets a loadout of up to 5 cards whenever you're in play. Now, you can change these cards on a short or long rest, but you can spend stress on your character sheet to essentially swap a card automatically on the spot. Now, some cards cost 0 stress to swap into your kit, so that's good, but some other cards cost up to 3 stress, depending on how powerful the ability is, making it much more of a choice whether you need to swap that in immediately. This is really good for some on-the-fly character changing for your kit and loadout, and it also doesn't bloat your character sheet with an excess of abilities that you need to kind of manage, and sometimes forget the use of some of your like spells, for instance. And the abilities do range quite widely, and they do range from in-combat and out-of-combat abilities. For instance, here, Deft Deceiver, the level 1 ability you can pick up as any class that has the Grace domain. You can spend hope to take advantage on a roll you make to deceive or trick someone into believing a lie you tell them. So this is really interesting because this can be done in and outside of combat, and you spend hope to essentially give yourself advantage, which is pretty cool. And there's a lot of features like this, and like I said, you get up to 5 cards eventually that you can use, and of course a vault that you can swap cards out of to sit or suit you for any kind of situation. Jumping back to the Bard here, all classes have 2 domains they're associated with, and each class guaranteed, at least at this point in the beta, have 1 domain they share with some other class. For instance, Codex here is actually shared with the Wizard class. And it's actually, I think, pretty standardly 2 classes, if I'm not mistaken. Now, there's the Evasion score. The Evasion score is whatever your evasion starts off as, but you can get equipment that can increase your evasion as well as other skills and abilities. Evasion's your character's general AC or 2-hit number, but it doesn't work quite the same. First of all, the GM, when they're rolling, only rolls a d20 rather than 2d12. So numbers that are somewhat above or below, above 10 are less likely for the GM to hit, and below 10 are more likely. So with a starting evasion 9 here, the GM's somewhat likely to hit you, more or less a 50-50, but with the increase of equipment and everything like that, even a Bard could dodge a fair number of hits. Now, in addition to that, we have damage thresholds. So the damage thresholds are how damage is actually done to your character sheet. I'm going to go ahead and show you guys a character that I've been using for our playtest stuff, so you can get a general idea of how it works. So here's Iggy, my giant wizard who uses rune gauntlets to punch people with magic, something I absolutely love. And you can see here that I've leveled him up to level 5 for the purpose of playtesting. You can see he has a low evasion, but he has 7 armor due to armor I'm wearing, and there's something here called armor slots. So if the GM rolls an 8 or higher with a d20 plus whatever modifiers the monsters have, which are not always positive, I might add, then if I'm hit, I'll need to decide whether I want to take the damage or reduce it by using armor. I have an armor value of 7 and 5 armor slots. I can use multiple armor slots to reduce a hit. Say I get a hit that does 12 damage to me. Well, if I use one of my armor slots, then it will do 5 damage to me. And if we check down here at my damage thresholds, 5 damage is more than my minor, but less than my major, meaning I will take a minor wound, which will tick off 1 of my HP here on the character sheet. Now, for minor, major, and severe wounds, they each deal different amounts of damage. So for instance, for a minor wound, you take 1, a major, you'll take 2 pips, and for a severe wound, you'll take 3 pips. And actually, one of the things that I find interesting in the game is you can't take more than 3 pips of damage, though there is an optional rule where if you ever receive double your severe, you actually get 4 pips. But that does mean that there are damage caps in this game, so your characters can't be killed in a singular hit. Now, some people might have some problem with that, and personally, I'm a little it's kind of whatever to me personally, because one, I don't think a one hit should ever happen in a game. I think that's bad game design when that happens, or bad encounter design when that happens. And it's something that it just shouldn't happen. A player's adventure shouldn't end like that. But some people think differently, and I think that's completely okay. We all have different styles of play, and honestly, I've played both, and I don't feel necessarily that this is very different. And in fact, depending on how some combats go, a lot of small hits can rack up on your character really fast, putting you in moral peril much easier than other games that have very bloated HP. Now, I'm going to hop back to armor real quick. So I mentioned that 12 damage before, and I could use a pip to reduce that to 5 damage. Well, if I use 2 pips, then I actually wouldn't take any damage as my armor soaks it all up. But armor is something that you can only restore on a short or long rest, which now's a really great time to talk about short or long rest. And I can actually hit this button here to kind of pull out. Oh, it doesn't show on the screen. It's fine. So a short rest is it says in the book an hour-long rest, or anytime your group has a time to take a breather. And during this time, you can restore some HP. You can restore up to 2 of your armor slots. You can restore some stress. You can prepare yourself for encounters ahead to give yourself extra hope. And you can see here on the character sheet, players actually have a maximum hope of 5. So if they get any more hope, they cannot gain any more and they overcap. But you can only select 2 options when you short rest. And when you long rest, many of the same options are there, but they're more powerful. Like, for instance, restoring all your armor slots or restoring all your missing health. But again, you only get 2, which means actually long resting is not as good as it is in something like D&D. Now, another thing I want to talk about while I'm here on the character sheet is how weapons work. So for a level 5 character, you're going to have 2 proficiency. The number of proficiency you have actually indicates how many damage dice you roll, and it doesn't increase your likelihood to hit. So with the arcane gauntlets, for instance, I punch using strength and add magic damage. So I have a little bit of a higher strength than my knowledge for a wizard. But when I strike, I add a +4 to my 2d12. And then when I hit them for damage, I add 2d10 damage. I have the advanced gauntlets here, +6. Lower level weapons are like +2 or might not even give you a plus. And this scales with proficiency. So if I had 3 proficiency, it'd be 3d10 +6. And that +6 modifier also doesn't change. It's based purely on the equipment. Last but not least, while looking here at the character sheet, I want to talk about your experiences. So during character creation, you have a set of experiences that you set up with the GM, and they pretty much act like skills from other TTRPGs, but they're a bit more vague. Rather than being a skill like survival, well, you can still do that, I might add. You can also have different types of skill or experiences that work very more specifically. Like Magic Historian on my character sheet gives me a +3 anytime I'm looking up anything based on magic history. Well, I also have a personal one based on a conversation we had, which is a video that will be coming out tomorrow, so check that one out. Down with Mark Ribiton, my character has an arch nemesis, and thus I took a skill which gives me a +1 anytime I'm doing something against my rival, Mark Ribiton. I also have a +2 to burn it with fire, which allows me anytime I'm burning something, whether it's enemies or just an object with anything, I can spend hope. And this is how experiences work. You spend hope to use one of your experiences. So if I'm using a fire spell against an enemy, I can spend hope to add +2 to that. Now, that's something I am actually going to have a little bit of a beef with in a little bit, but it's an overall interesting system, and it makes it so that characters can very specialize what their character is good at without necessarily having a system force them to be good at specific things. One last thing I want to talk about the rules, and then we'll get to my impressions, is the flow of combat. So how combat generally works is very similar to how many rules-like games play. There's no initiative system, and rather, the players and the GM will interact with each other, telling a narrative story. Players can take multiple actions, and the GM can possibly follow suit. And how I mean by that is every time the player uses an action, they set a token on the action tracker. The action tracker is used in any kind of conflict, typically, where it's the player versus the GM, and any situation, not just combat. This can be used in narrative like social play as well. So anytime the players use an action, the GM can spend those action tokens to have the enemy fight. In the very simplest terms, if a player is fighting against an enemy, the player can use an action, and then the GM can immediately have the enemy react or counteract the action based on what the player does. For instance, if a player rolls with fear and succeeds, the player gets to hit the enemy, but the GM gets a fear, and the GM can then attack the player back, possibly using that fear they just gained to have the enemy do a more powerful attack to keep the narrative flowing. It's a very flowy kind of combat system that doesn't adhere to any rigid initiative systems. In fact, it's very recommended that the GM allow the players to get a chance to act before having the enemies get to act. And the GM doesn't have to spend all action tokens at once. The GM can spend action tokens to activate so many enemies, keeping a few in reserve for some cool counterattacks. Enemies even have special features like group attacks that allow the GM to spend fear to have a bunch of enemies act on a single action token. So that being the case, it's a very push and pull with the players. The players not only giving the GM more power or less power, whether they roll hope or fear, but also giving the GM actions to use against them whenever they use actions. It's a very interesting system, and I definitely do have some thoughts, but this is a very narrative game that has some mechanics on top of it to add a little bit more rules validity, I guess, to how combat goes. You're never going to really defeat an enemy without hitting their hit points, for instance. And it's in most enemies, unless the GM decides otherwise, which, it's a tabletop game, has a specific number of hits they can take. And most enemies don't even have armor. Instead, they have higher difficulties to hit them based on their armor. So the players aren't working against a similar system. It all flows with the idea that the players can do whatever their actions are and the GM can respond in kind. We're about to get to my impressions, but before we do so, if you like this kind of content and if you love tabletops in general, please consider subscribing to the channel so you get more opportunities to see my content. And if you could do me a little favor and at least like the video or dislike, however you want to do it, then it allows other people to see the content. I especially think Daggerheart is a game worth looking into for sure. So any kind of support on the channel, I would greatly appreciate. Let's go ahead and talk about my personal impressions of Daggerheart. We have a live play where we've played the game and, we learned it just like anyone else would. So you can go and check that out. I'll leave a little mark up here in the corner for you to go check out that, or you can just go to the live tab and check out the Daggerheart video. I don't know if we're going to do more, honestly. We might do a level 5 version, depending on if we have some players sick for the next, our next weekly game. But at this point, we've played a bunch online and offline, so I want to give my general impressions of it. Daggerheart is a rules-like game, and for me personally, I'm more of a chunky. I like chunkier games. I like games that give very narrative weight to the mechanics, so that I can tell a story using the build of my character, and the build feels like it's impactful. That being the case, I actually really like Daggerheart because it's a rules-light game that provides more chunk, validating a lot of build choices, which is something I particularly enjoy. It's not my favorite type of game, but after playing it, Daggerheart has definitely jumped up into my about top 10 TTRPGs that I enjoy. I don't know exactly where it places, but it's definitely jumped into the top 10 because it feels really good. I am super impressed with the overall functionality of the game. The duality dice are interesting. I think it's a very interesting way to have a very push and pull with the game. When players succeed, they succeed well, but players can also succeed with some minor consequences, giving some variance to what's going on, and it keeps narrative going. The GM needs to come up with some kind of consequence whenever they succeed with fear, and that, I think, creates interesting stories, but it also is a little vague. And honestly, it is something that requires a certain level of GM mastery and narrative mastery in order to get right. So, one of the things I generally dislike with the system is how when players get a good roll and succeed with fear, they still can feel punished based on how the GM words it. A player can get a really good roll. They can succeed the check, they go in and they strike the dragon, dealing lots of damage, but the dragon could also attack them. And if it hurts the player a ton by doing that, then you get a situation where the player got a really good roll and gets punished for it. Now, a good GM would not necessarily put the player in that situation, or might even have the dragon attack with disadvantage due to the pain of the strike, meaning that even though the dragon does hit, it has a harder time doing so. And there's a lot of different ways that consequences can be done using the environment and all kinds of things, but the system leaves it vague for the purpose of allowing the GM to take it. Which one of my players said something very interesting during our live play, which was that the game seems really easy for the players, but a lot harder for the GM because the GM has to come up with how certain consequences work. If you want a game that handholds you, that tells you every little thing that happens and when it happens, then this is not going to be the game for you. Plain and simple. But if you're a GM that is confident in their improv skill and is really good at creating interesting narrative, even if it comes at punishing the players a little bit, this is going to be a really good game. For me personally, this game runs really well, but I have a lot of experience being a GM. A newer GM might struggle with a lot of the GM fiat that comes in with just how they have to how they have to arbitrate the rules based on the vague things mentioned in the book. It's something that I think has a lot of strengths, but like any game has a lot of weaknesses as well, and it's going to suit certain groups better than others. Another thing that I particularly found troublesome in the game is how it's just not balanced. I'll give you a good example. So earlier I mentioned the dwarf, which is hiding here behind my head, which they have a very powerful ability where they can spend 3 hope to reduce any physical damage they get in half. That's a very good ability, but elf here has celestial trance, taking from D&D as being one of its core influences, obviously. It says when you do, roll a number of d8s equal to your stress. You have marked and clear all stress. Any of these dice have a matching value. Also clear all hit points. So on a rest, a short or on a long rest specifically, where you can already clear HP and stress, elves can just clear stress automatically. Elves do not need to, on a long rest, ever worry about stress because they can clear it and potentially clear their HP. Now, not every character interacts with all of the systems equally. Some classes interact with stress more than others, and simultaneously, some classes worry more about armor or HP more. And so sometimes during a long rest, which is something that happens once per game day, the elf gets their feature that allows them to essentially ignore one of the long rest things, allowing them to do something else. And then they can gamble on another one, which might not even be overly affected. And you can restore HP and stress on a short rest, and you get 3 short rests before you need to take a long rest. So this just might not come in. And honestly, it's something that I can't see being very appetizing to players when you have something like the dwarf who just leans into being a tank. Or you can make a squishier class tankier with it, which is something that I feel is very interesting. Elf doesn't play into any particular playstyle choice. It just allows you to have better long rests, which can be good, but also can just be nothing. And it's not the only Ancestries that does this. Another thing that is a personal thing, really, more than anything. You can see the Firbolg here, which is from D&D, but this version of it specifically is very much more of the Critical Role variant, the cow face type individuals. This game is very much influenced by Critical Role and its campaigns. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, this kind of builds onto what they've been working on for all these years. For someone who's not super into Critical Role, or even like dislikes Critical Role, stuff like this is going to be a big turnoff. And honestly, to me, it feels more like the Firbolg specifically, because they have some interesting ones like the Clank, which is more relevant to the recent campaign, or the Fawn, which I think is a very interesting ancestry. The Firbolg seems very weird and out of place. It's something that it feels like this is here because it's Critical Role, rather than actually having an interesting purpose in the setting. Though I will say, one thing I particularly like about how they do this is in the PDF, in the play material that we have access to, and they'll probably be in the main book, for each of the ancestries, they do provide a lot of art that provides a lot of interesting ideas and visuals for the characters. And not only that, but they have art that shows better representation than most games. A lot of games have one, maybe two art pieces, like a male-female art piece, that really base the whole ancestry on, when many of these small sketch arts, be that as they may, provide a lot more interesting ideas for how characters can be represented. The Dracona, for instance, being more lizard-like, being more reptilian, or being more kind of humanoid with draconic features is very interesting. Another thing that I think a lot of people are going to enjoy is a better representation of general body types. We have here a pretty thick elf, and honestly, that's something that I like to see because it makes the ancestries feel much more, I guess, real in a sense. You're seeing people here who have features. I mean, like, look at the hips. Look at the hips on this one, for instance. Like, there's all kinds of different body features for ancestries that have very traditionally been very specific on their body types. I mean, they've even brought back female dwarves with beards here, which is something that I know a lot of people have actually been asking for, and it's something I'm glad to see here in the book. This game is made with all kinds of love and intent for its players and for the setting that they're going into, and it's something that I very much appreciate. Anything I have to say here about the general playtest or the rules are subject to change, I might add, but more specifically, it's something that shows a lot of potential and a lot of promise. There's a lot of things I like, and while maybe it's not balanced exactly as I like, that's of course what the playtest is for. And if I was to mention anything specifically about the system that I kind of struggle with as far as concepts is generally the action token system feels very wishy-washy, and it feels like it's just a lot to manage as a GM specifically. You're managing not only the action tokens, deciding when the action needs to happen, but also your fear and using your fear abilities. And honestly, when I was running a GM, I had more fear than I could manage. I kept capping my fear because I couldn't spend it. And actually, during our playtest, I was using fear incorrectly, overspending it for just any enemy move, and I still overcapped all the time. It's something that the game is it fluxes very hard based on player, like, how players work. And also the hope and fear system, it's a coin flip. Every time you roll the dice, even if you roll well, it's a coin flip whether it's really good or kind of good because something bad happens in tandem. That kind of system makes it somewhat difficult to really feel good as a player if you do, like, for instance, roll nothing but fear. You have a 50-50 chance, sure, but sometimes you can coin flip 5 heads in a row, you know? You get fear over and over and over, and that can feel really bad. Like, everything you do feels like more of a struggle compared to your other players who might be rolling with hope a lot. This can create weird dynamics around things like luck and balance that I feel like can be used correctly. Like I said earlier, the consequences are something that makes stories interesting. No, if everything went perfectly, stories wouldn't be quite so fascinating. But simultaneously, from a player perspective, if you roll fear a lot of the time, it just feels bad. And if you roll a lot of hope, it doesn't really feel like anything at all because hope isn't necessarily overly good. You just get more of a resource that maybe, depending on your build, you might not even be able to spend enough of. So, it's like it's either it kind of feels bad when it happens too much, or it doesn't really feel overly hype when it happens too often when it comes to like fear versus hope, respectively. I think overall the game is really nice. I think the game offers a level of chunk to a rules light system that players like me really appreciate who like chunkier games. But this game system is not inherently going to stick with a wide audience in that regard. I feel like a lot of people who enjoy rules light games, this will feel a little too chunky for them. And for people who prefer chunkier rules heavy type games, this is going to feel a little too rules light. And so this is going to play to a very casual viewer base. And at the beginning of this video, I kind of alluded to this. Is Daggerheart the D&D killer? No, obviously. No matter how successful Critical Role is, they can't compete with a multi-billionaire company like Hasbro. And Hasbro can pump out as much content as they want. And whether you like it or not, whether you think D&D is a good game or not, it's going to maintain market relevance by sheer volume of accessibility. That's just how it is, plain and simple. But for a casual gamer scene and for Critical Role, which honestly helped elevate D&D to the level of popularity it is nowadays, I do think we're going to see a lot of people casually start moving towards Daggerheart over D&D. And that's mostly because this game is more player friendly in my opinion. A lot of it is just player and GM fiat. So the players aren't restricted on any actions they can do. And even in combat, they can create more interesting scenes because they're not locked down by a weird turn based system. That in itself is really cool. Now, I think GMs are going to struggle with this one more. Newer GMs, I feel, will actually benefit from playing games like D&D 5e more than they will from Daggerheart because it allows you to have more answers for more standard situations. And it's only when you dive into D&D that GM fiat becomes more of a thing. But this game, GM fiat is something that needs to happen right out the gate. So the GM needs to be a good arbitrator of the rules and adjudicator when it comes to making sure that the game is both fun and challenging for the players. So it's a strange game that has a higher pressure on GMs to perform while being easier for players to get into. I like this game. And let me come center frame here. Right. And let me finish off this video. I like this game a lot. I think it's really fun. I think it's really interesting. I like a lot of the mechanics. And honestly, it does one of the things I like in tabletop, which is you have a really cool idea, and then you just steal a lot of ideas from other games. The advantage disadvantage system is literally just the same one that Lancer uses. And many of the other systems in this game are very similar. The use of stress in some situations very much feels like Blades in the Dark to some people, and it takes a lot of these things without really mimicking them. Candela Obscura, you could argue, was very inspired by Blades of the Dark and played very similarly. While many, even of its harshest critics, do admit that they are just different games. But this game doesn't play like any other game on the market specifically. Granted, like I said, it does take a lot of ideas and a lot of systems from other games, and it does have a very almost too D&D-esque feel. It's something that like I've mentioned to my friends many times. I'm tired of the D&D versions of fantasy. I want something that feels very new and different. And this is not a system that feels very new and different in setting or theme. It is a game that is very heavily influenced influenced by Critical Role and how it's run its games, but in a system that is more narratively focused and provides a lot more opportunities for the GMs and the players to tell the story rather than having the system tell the story for them. And that's where this review kind of ends. You're going to like this game if you want a crunchier rules light game that allows the players and the GM to tell an interesting story without being restricted by the game. You're going to hate this game if you want more guidance on how to run your games, if you want the system to be more of a simulation for you, or if you're just looking for some more overall crunch to validate the game. Skills in this game are very light and very vague and can be kind of confusing. I like games like Pathfinder 2E, and I'll say right now, Pathfinder 2E is still my favorite game. And I like Pathfinder 2E specifically because skills have specific skill feats so that my character's build feels thematic. The in combat and out of combat are a part of my build rather than just a part of my story. And in this game, your build is your combat stuff mostly, with some exceptions with some of the moves. And your skills or your experiences in this game are more narratively focused, not necessarily being something super mechanically impactful. And in fact, if an experience is too mechanically impactful, it's actually a negative thing in this system, as experiences should be very specific circumstances or situations. So overuse of experiences is actually a bad thing, which is strange because it's a mechanical thing. It gives you a mechanical bonus to your dice rolls. So you would want to use it as much as possible, but that's kind of a negative thing in the game. Would you like Daggerheart? I don't know. That's a you thing. That's not a me thing. I can't tell you whether you're going to like Daggerheart. You can agree with the things I've said in this video or disagree with the things I've said in this video. You're going to have to decide. And the great thing is everything Daggerheart is currently available for free in their open beta that you can all try now. So, go try it out. See if you like it for yourself. I recommend this game for people who like chunkier games that want to try a rules light type system because this flows very differently than chunkier games. It's a lot more free and narrative based. And I know a lot of people out there would like that. And I wouldn't recommend this game to anyone who wants a much crunchier, harder system or who just wants to tell a story without too many rules getting in the way. So this game sits comfortably in the middle of the two extremes. And I think that's a very good place for this game to sit. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. And I'll see y'all next time. I got more Daggerheart content coming out, so stay tuned on the channel. There's a lot to dive into this game. And if you want a more informed opinion, stay tuned. Bye.